The gavel had barely struck when the room fell into a silence, so sharp it seemed to slice through the heavy air of the courtroom. For a moment, no one breathed. No one moved. Judge Richard Leon, a man accustomed to commanding every eye in the chamber, leaned back in his chair, his authority rattled in a way no one present had ever witnessed. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, calm, steady, and unflinching. In just a few piercing words, she had managed the unthinkable. She froze the room, and even Leon himself in stunned disbelief. What made the silence electrifying was not only the force of her words, but the contrast of who spoke them. Crockett, a woman whose journey was carved through resilience, sacrifice, and the kind of grit that comes only from knowing the odds are stacked against you, had just faced down a man who represented everything untouchable, immovable, and absolute about American power. Leon was supposed to be the immovable object, yet here he was, visibly shaken, his lips tightening as though to conceal the fact that, for the first time in decades, he had been outmatched in his own domain. Spectators shifted in their seats. A journalist in the back nearly dropped his pen. One attorney whispered, "Did she just say that?" As though repeating it aloud might make the moment real. It was more than a courtroom exchange. It was a collision of two Americas. The old guard that clung to hierarchy and intimidation, and the new voice rising with unflinching clarity, demanding to be heard. Crockett didn't simply speak to the judge. She spoke through him, to every person who had ever been dismissed, silenced, or underestimated. And yet, for all the intensity in that moment, what struck the audience most was not rage or theatrics. It was a precision. Crockett's words carried the weight of justice sharpened to a blade's edge, cutting away the veneer of untouchable authority that Judge Leon had long wrapped around himself. The silence could not last forever. It never does. But in those suspended seconds, as the weight of her challenge settled into every corner of the room, one truth became undeniable. Nothing in that courtroom would ever be the same again. And what led to this breathtaking confrontation? That story begins long before the silence, in a battle of ideals that would only grow louder. Tio understand why the silence of that courtroom carried such weight. You have to step back and see the stakes that hung in the air long before Jasmine Crockett ever opened her mouth. This was not just a legal hearing, nor a clash of personalities. It was a trial of narratives. What kind of America would be heard in that chamber, and which voice would dominate the future? Judge Richard Leon had long stood as a symbol of unchallenged authority. His reputation preceded him. A man whose rulings echoed across decades, whose word could alter lives, businesses, even entire communities. People entered his courtroom expecting to shrink beneath his stare, to be measured and dismissed by the weight of his title alone. In many ways, he wasn't just a judge. He was an embodiment of the system that thrived on hierarchy and demanded obedience. To question him was to question the very structure of power. And that is exactly what Jasmine Crockett did. By stepping into that chamber with unflinching resolve, she brought more than her own voice. She carried the weight of countless stories, countless people who had been told they didn't belong, who had been silenced by arrogance dressed as authority. Every word she chose was more than an argument. It was an act of defiance against the idea that power should go unquestioned simply because it has always been so. For progressives watching, the stakes extended beyond the courtroom walls. This was about identity, belonging, and the promise that dignity doesn't bow to intimidation. Crockett wasn't simply defending a case. She was defending the idea that truth, courage, and equality still had a place in America's most hallowed institutions. And that is why, when her words froze the room, the silence wasn't just shock, it was revelation. But even revelations come with tension. Because while the silence gave Crockett a momentary triumph, it also triggered something in Leon. A need to reassert control, to prove that a weight of authority could not be unraveled by a single voice. And so, the stage was set for escalation. The giant would not fall quietly. He would fight to reestablish his dominance. What he didn't realize was that every attempt to silence her would only sharpen her resolve and make the clash that followed inevitable. To understand the magnitude of what Jasmine Crockett accomplished in that courtroom, you have to know the man she stood against. Judge Richard Leon was not some faceless bureaucrat. He was a towering figure in Washington's judicial world, a man whose very presence commanded deference. For decades, attorneys whispered his name with a mix of respect and dread. His rulings shaped industries, His opinions reshaped policy, and his gavel seemed to strike not just with law, but with the weight of an era that believed authority was to be feared, not questioned. Leon cultivated an image of being unshakable. His voice was sharp, his questions cutting his patience thin. To stand before him was to enter a battlefield where he always held the higher ground. He was known to raise an eyebrow that could rattle even seasoned lawyers, to dismiss arguments with a wave of his hand as if they were unworthy of his time. Over the years, he came to embody the very thing that so many progressives saw as a problem, a system where arrogance masqueraded as wisdom and authority often went unchecked. Yet beneath the robe, contradictions lived. Leon prided himself on impartiality, but critics pointed to moments when his decisions tilted toward entrenched interests. He demanded respect, but often withheld it from those he deemed beneath him. He believed himself the guardian of order, yet sometimes it seemed that order served power more than people. By the time Jasmine Crockett faced him, Leon's reputation was larger than life. To the outside world, he was the immovable object. To those inside the courtroom, he was a storm they had to survive. Few had ever dared to confront him directly, and fewer still had managed to leave him unsettled. That was his strength and his shield. But there was one flaw in his armor, the assumption that no one could pierce it. Decades of dominance had made him believe that intimidation would always prevail, that silence would always follow his authority. What he never accounted for was someone like Crockett, someone who refused to bow, who had carved her own strength from struggle, and who saw in his arrogance not power, but weakness. And that miscalculation would soon unravel everything. If Judge Richard Leon represented the old guard power, then Jasmine Crockett embodied the rising spirit of a new America, one that refused to be silenced, one that carried the weight of countless voices long pushed aside. Her journey to that courtroom was not built on privilege or entitlement. It was forged in fire, in the relentless trials of proving herself again and again in a system that was never designed to welcome her. Crockett's story begins far from the ornate chambers of Washington, in communities where struggle was not an exception but a way of life. She saw firsthand how ordinary people bore the brunt of decisions made in distant halls of power, how families suffered when justice bent to wealth or influence. It was there she learned that silence was not an option, that dignity required speaking up even when the odds told you stay quiet. These were not abstract lessons. They were lived realities, shaping her into someone who would one day stand in the very places where silence had been enforced for generations. Her rise was anything but smooth. As a young attorney and later a public servant, Crockett faced a double bind of being underestimated and over-scrutinized. Doors were closed to her before she even reached them. Her opponents mistook her poise for inexperience, her conviction for naivete. Time after time, she had to prove that her presence was not a gift from the system, but a hard-won claim. And each time she proved them wrong, she carried those scars as fuel, sharpening her voice, her arguments, her resolve. What set her apart was not just intellect. It was her refusal to disconnect the fight for justice from the lived struggles of ordinary people. She wasn't a politician chasing headlines, nor a lawyer looking for prestige. She was, at her core, an advocate. Every case, every debate, every confrontation carried more than her career. It carried the weight of those who rarely had a seat at the table. Her strength came not from entitlement, but from empathy, from the recognition that her victory was never hers alone. It belonged to communities who trusted her to carry their stories into rooms designed to exclude them. By the time she stood in Judge Leon's courtroom, Crockett was no stranger to hostility or condescension. She had weathered it all. Raised voices meant to drown her out. Dismissive smirks meant to belittle her. Systemic walls meant to contain her. Yet none of it broke her. In fact, it built her. She had learned to hold her ground with steadiness that unnerved her opponents, to let their arrogance be the rope by which they stumbled. That day, facing Leon, she was not an underdog. She was the culmination of every battle fought, every silence broken, every voice she had ever carried with her. And though the judge may have expected another figure to shrink beneath his stare, what he found instead was a woman who would not move, who had been preparing her entire life for this moment. And the closer the confrontation drew, the clearer it became. Crockett wasn't just ready, she was inevitable. The air in the chamber grew heavier with each exchange, as though the walls themselves were bracing for collision. Judge Richard Leon leaned forward, his voice sharp and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of his authority. He interrupted, redirected, and pressed with a kind of domineering cadence that had silenced so many before. Every sentence was a reminder, this is my courtroom, this is my domain. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She listened, her eyes steady, her posture composed. Where others might have rushed to fill the silence or stumbled over defensive explanations, she allowed Leon's words to hang in the air, refusing to be rattled. It was a calculated patience, one that unsettled him more than any raised voice could. The judge pushed harder, expecting to see cracks, but found none. Spectators sensed a shift. What began as a predictable imbalance, an unyielding judge towering over a younger challenger, was becoming something far less certain. Leon's tone sharpened, growing clipped, his gestures more pronounced. Crockett, by contrast, grew calmer, her responses sharper, each one precise enough to reveal the gaps in his arguments without the need for theatrics. It was a duel of two energies, arrogance meeting discipline, dominance meeting resilience. Each time Leon sought to corner her, she redirected the pressure with composure that seemed almost surgical. He grew louder. She grew steadier. He pressed faster. She slowed the pace. The contrast was striking, and for those watching, impossible to ignore. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Even seasoned attorneys exchanged glances, aware they were witnessing something unusual. Leon was accustomed to rattling others, but here he was visibly unsettled, forced onto unfamiliar ground by someone who refused to play by the script he had written for her. The escalation was no longer simply about the case. It was about control. Leon fought to maintain the towering image that had defined his career, but Crockett's refusal to yield made each of his efforts appear more desperate. With every calm rebuttal, with every poised silence, she stripped away the veneer of invincibility he wore like a robe. And then, as the tension reached its breaking point, Crockett leaned forward, preparing to speak words that would shatter the balance entirely. The room didn't know it yet, but it was about to witness a moment that would be remembered long after the gavel struck. The hush before Jasmine Crockett spoke was almost unbearable. Judge Leon had just finished another pointed interruption, his words sharpened like blades meant to cut her down. But instead of recoiling, she let the silence linger, let the weight of his arrogance hang in the air until every eye in the courtroom turned to her. Then, with a calm that belied the storm around her, she delivered a line that would echo far beyond those walls. Her words were simple, precise, but carried the force of a hammer striking glass. She dismantled his assertion not with anger, but with unshakable clarity, exposing the cracks in his argument for all to see. There was no raised voice, no theatrics, just truth spoken with such confidence that it stripped away the authority he had cloaked himself in for decades. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A journalist dropped his pen. One attorney pressed a hand to his mouth as if to contain his shock. Even the stenographer, whose job was to remain unshaken, hesitated for a split second before her fingers found the keys again. For a moment, it seemed the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. And Judge Leon? He froze. The man who had built a reputation on never being outmaneuvered, never being rattled, sat back in his chair, lips pressed in, eyes narrowing as though searching for a response that simply wouldn't come. His gavel, usually a weapon of control, lay untouched at his side. The silence around him wasn't obedience. It was defeat. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her composure in the aftermath was its own victory, her stillness louder than any applause could have been. By refusing to match his bluster and instead letting her words speak for themselves, she shifted the balance of power in that room entirely. She had done what few believed possible. She had stunned Judge Richard Leon into silence. The audience knew instinctively they had just witnessed something rare, something historic. It wasn't merely about a case anymore. It was about the triumph of courage over intimidation, of truth over arrogance. But as the shock settled and murmurs began to stir, no one realized that this moment was only the beginning. The real shockwave would not be confined to that courtroom. It was about to ripple outward, across the country, igniting a storm that even Crockett herself could not have fully anticipated. News of Jasmine Crockett's takedown spread faster than the stenographer's transcript could leave the courtroom. Within minutes, phones lit up with alerts. Clips of the exchange appeared on Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube, flooding timelines with captions like, "She silenced a judge," and "A courtroom mic drop for the ages." Hashtag surged. Hashtag Crockett moment. Hashtag truth in power. Hashtag Leon shaken. Commentators scrambled to weigh in. Some marveled at her composure. Others framed it as a turning point for the new generation of political leaders. For ordinary people scrolling at home, it felt personal. "She spoke for us," one user wrote, racking up thousands of likes. For once, someone wasn't afraid. Memes painted Leon as a fallen giant, while Crockett's calm face became a symbol of resilience. The media frenzy turned the courtroom into a national stage. Late-night hosts replayed the clip with theatrical gasps. Politicians who rarely agreed on anything shared a rare consensus. Crockett had turned a moment of intimidation into a lesson in courage. But beneath the praise, a deeper current was building. This wasn't just about one courtroom exchange. It was about the cracks showing in an old order that had long held sway. Crockett had revealed what could happen when arrogance was confronted by clarity. And once that revelation was seen, it could not be unseen. The silence in that courtroom was gone. In its place, the roar of a nation hungry for change. Jasmine Crockett didn't leave the chamber claiming victory. She left with something greater. The knowledge that her words had carried further than the walls around her. She had shown that dignity doesn't bow to intimidation, and that truth, spoken calmly, firmly, and without apology, can pierce through the strongest armor of arrogance. For her supporters, the lesson was clear. Power isn't invincible. Authority isn't sacred. What matters is the courage to stand in the storm and refuse to move. In that moment, Crockett wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who has ever been told to stay silent, to stay small, to let the giants decide their fate. And that is why the moment matters. Not because she stunned a judge, but because she reminded the nation that justice belongs to those who demand it. That unforgettable moment, when Jasmine Crockett stood unshaken and left Judge Richard Leon in stunned silence, was more than a clash in a courtroom. It was a message to every viewer. Courage can rewrite the script. Truth can shatter intimidation. And dignity, once spoken aloud, cannot be silenced. Here on Argument Arena, we believe these stories matter because they show us who we are and who we can be. Crockett's words remind us that justice isn't abstract. It's alive in every confrontation, every challenge, every refusal to bow. Now it's your turn. What did you feel watching Crockett stand? Did her composure inspire you? Did it remind you of moments in your own life where you refused to back down? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want this to be more than a video. We want it to be a conversation. And if you believe in amplifying voices that speak truth to power, then join us. Subscribe to Argument Arena, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that dignity always triumphs over arrogance. Because moments like these aren't just history. They're fuel for the future. And together, we're just getting started.